My name is Robin Hackey. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Community Investment. Thank you for listening today. The goal of this presentation is to familiarize you with the framework that we've developed to help communities attract and deploy capital to achieve their priorities. As you'll see, our starting point is the fact that place matters. As you all know, zip code in many areas determines opportunity. For many communities struggling with the legacy of discrimination, capital doesn't flow at all. Rather, in our capitalist-oriented system, capital flows downhill to the easiest and most profitable investments. The results, communities that look like the ones on the right, are not at all consistent with our values. These are places where kids don't have the opportunity to grow up with good education, with safe and healthy housing, with parents who are employed by jobs that are paying fair wages and that they can reach without spending hours in commute. The center asks, what would it take to level the playing field so that capital could flow to the places that need it most? And what we found in our work is that the truth of what Sister Lillian has been quoted as saying is really quite apparent, that need is everywhere, but where can we find opportunity? Let me first do a moment of definition and clarify what actually do we mean by community investment. Community investment is capital that goes to underserved communities to provide goods and services like affordable housing or access to healthy food or support for minority businesses that are not being provided by mainstream markets. When we say community investment, we're not talking primarily about grants. Even though investment sometimes is used poetically to say we're investing, for example, in the future of our children, what we mean by investment is actually money that gets paid back. So when we talk about community investment, we're talking about financing of all kinds, whether that's project finance or municipal bonds or other kinds of investments where there is at least some return on the original capital invested. That may be principal only, or it may be principal with a below market rate of return, or it may be a full market rate of return, risk adjusted or not. But we're not really talking about what we call funding, which would pay for programs or other kinds of consumable goods and services. In finance, people expect to be repaid. In funding, they may expect to achieve a return, a social return, but not a financial return. So this work grew out of the Living Cities Integration Initiative, where we had a pot of capital, financial capital, to deploy in places like Baltimore, Cleveland, and Detroit, which were, by all definitions, underinvested communities. And despite having $50 million in commercial debt and another $20 million of program-related investment from foundations, we couldn't find places to deploy that capital. And so we started asking, why was that? Our simple theory of change had said that if you bring capital to underinvested communities, you would have plenty of opportunities to deploy it. And yet what we saw was that there needed to be some way to organize demand. We couldn't take it for granted that there would be opportunities to invest our money. And so we started interviewing practitioners in the community investment field. And they told us all kinds of stories about tax credit adventures and zoning changes and near-death experiences of various kinds. And we realized when we reflected on those stories that what we were hearing about was actually a heroic quest. And what you see here is Odysseus trying to come home from Troy. And so as soon as we saw these near-death experiences, we began to understand that community investment as it's practiced in the United States is kind of an episodic thing. It's against all odds, it's against the system, and it actually is not a repetitive kind of routine activity at the scale of the need. And here actually is why. If you look at this diagram, which is in some ways a testament to human creativity, what you see is what does it take to overcome the regular gravitational forces of our system and make money flow uphill to the places that it doesn't go naturally. And so what you see here, which is an actual transaction, is a blending of different kinds of capital, specialized intermediaries, new markets, tax credits, and low-income housing tax credits and community development corporations, all kinds of specialized entities that you could imagine the legal fees and the persistence required to put together, that made this transaction actually quite a successful mixed-use development. But when you look at a transaction like this, you begin to understand why community investment can feel like a heroic quest. This is not a scalable model. This is the kind of deal that you do and then you rest. So the question that we've been asking is, what would it take to make community investment more routine, more systematic, and more repeatable? And what we found over the years as we've worked across the country in different places is that an effective community investment system really needs to be performing three rather simple functions effectively. It doesn't matter who is actually doing these functions. It's not about the nouns we say, it's about the verbs. But if these three things are happening in a place, then community investment is more likely to be going on. So what I'd like to do now is walk through each of these functions sort of briefly, and then come back and do a double click on each one so that you can see what this might look like in your community. So the first function is the articulation of a set of shared priorities. And what we mean by shared priorities is an operational vision that's specific enough to shape decisions. So not good things for all God's children, not a vision that our community will be the best place to raise a family, but actually something that's specific enough to say, if $5 million landed on us tomorrow, would we agree where it should go? That's what we mean by shared priorities, and I'll come back to that. The second function is the creation and execution of a set of deals and projects that would actually add up, if they were all done, to the realization of the community's strategic priorities. And so that implies a certain amount of batching, and it also implies a match between the deals that are in the pipeline and the priorities that the community is trying to achieve. And we'll come back to that as well. Finally is the enabling environment. And what we mean by this is that there are efforts underway to shape the context in which the pipeline is executed. So an enabling environment can foster or impede the progress of the pipeline, and we're talking about finding all the ways to make the pipeline easier to execute. So let me give you some examples. When we talk about shared priorities, what we mean is coming up with things at the right altitude, where things are broad enough to matter. In other words, it's a compelling enough, broad enough result so that a lot of stakeholders would care about getting it realized, and yet specific enough, operational enough to shape decisions. So we don't mean, as I said, good things for all God's children, and we also don't mean that the grocery store should be built on the corner of 5th and Main. What we mean is that for the moment, let's say for a couple of years, it would be important to concentrate development around transit, or it would be important to look at these particular stops on a transit line that are about to tip in some way and stabilize that neighborhood. So it's not a forever set of priorities. It's something that's compelling now. It may be what we call a wet cement moment, where something is going to happen one way or the other, and so it's urgent to address it right now. It may be a market-driven thing because of gentrification and the risk of displacement. It may be something that has happened because of an emergency, like recovery from a natural disaster. But the shared priorities are time-bound, and they're specific enough to help people make choices. So how do you know if you have shared priorities? What you would do is what we call the Martian test. And what that involves is really something very simple. You write on a sheet of paper, what is it that we think are the shared priorities of our community? And then you cover the column and you say, how is the community spending its discretionary time and its discretionary resources? So for example, look at the community development block grants and where are they going? Are they going to the thing that you thought was the priority, or are they going somewhere else? Very often what we find is that things get chunked up like into equal parts or spread around like peanut butter. And if you're finding that in your community, the community development block grants are being divided by the number of city council members, then you really don't have a set of shared priorities. because it's only by concentrating scarce time and resources that you have a chance of overcoming inertia, overcoming gravity, and making these priorities really come into existence. So let's talk for a moment about the pipeline. The pipeline is a set of deals, a set of investments or projects that together would add up to the realization of the community's strategic priorities. Pipelines have to be created, and that creation is the work of what we call the deal generators over on the right-hand side of the slide. So deal generators can be a whole variety of different actors. They may be affordable housing developers. They may be community development corporations. Sometimes they can be anchor institutions or others who can spot opportunities. Regardless of where the deals come from, they tend to then go to a set of intermediaries. And again, those intermediaries look different in different communities. Some places are blessed with what's called a community development financial institution, often a not-for-profit intermediary or a bank that specializes in doing the work of making money flow uphill, blending unlikely sources, making gap financing appear, and getting deals that would otherwise not happen through the pipeline. But CDFIs are not the only kinds of intermediaries that can do this work. In some communities, often in the South or the Southwest, where CDFIs are not quite as thick on the ground, we found that development finance agencies can play the role of intermediary very successfully. And DFAs can be of different kinds. In Ohio, there are about 40 different port authorities that play the role of intermediary very successfully. Some of the DFAs are more or less mission-oriented or more or less mission-aligned with the community's priorities, and obviously finding the intermediaries that are a good match is critical. But many different kinds of organizations can play those roles. Sometimes they're redevelopment authorities, which may be regional, they may be local, sometimes they're statewide. But in any case, the role of the intermediaries is to serve as the go-between between the sources of capital, who are listed above, and the users of capital or deal generators that we talked about below. So a good pipeline adds up to the community's priorities, and that means two things. First, it means that there's a match in type. So if the community's priority is small business development, but every deal in the pipeline is about affordable housing, then the pipeline doesn't add up, and that's more common than you would think. Another test of the pipeline is its size, and this is a very significant factor that we find to be a problem in many, many communities. Assessing the sufficiency of the pipeline, do we have enough deals to meet the size of the problem or to address the stated need, is really an issue in many, many places, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So the final function is the enabling environment. People often think about this in terms of policy, and clearly policy is very important, not only the determination of policy, but the enforcement of policy. But policies are only one piece of the enabling environment. It's just as important to look at institutional practices, the way business is done, the platforms that exist for collaboration so that people can get across silos and across sectors to work together, the funding flows, the resources that are available. So for example, have people decided to tax themselves in different ways to achieve the priorities? That can be anything from a soda tax to a developer user fee to any kind of tariff or other money source that can be used to move the priorities. It also involves looking at the capacities and the relationships and the data that get used in the service of community investment. It's important to think about what kinds of information do people have and rely on when they're making decisions. Do we know, for example, where the vacant parcels are or underutilized land that could be an important part of solving the community's priorities? Do we know what the demand is for a certain kind of service, like a grocery store or other kind of business? So finding the right data for decision making can be a really important way to enrich the enabling environment. The actors in the enabling environment include, as you might expect, state and local government officials and elected people, but they also can include civic organizations, philanthropy, anchor institutions, Again, it's more about the verbs than about the nouns. So let me tell you a story of what it looks like when these functions break through and actually are used to bring the community investment system to scale. We did some work when I was a fellow at Kresge a year and a half ago with the Bay Area. It was one of 3 communities that we supported over a couple of year period. And the way we worked with them was through the Great Communities Collaborative, which was a very successful and interesting multi-sector collaboration housed at the San Francisco Foundation that was really trying to think about equitable transit-oriented development in the Bay Area. They included representatives of the Metropolitan Planning Organization and other groups that were interested in land use. It included representatives from BART, the transit agency, from philanthropy, from banks, from CDFIs, from affordable housing advocates. It was a wonderful, and still is, a wonderful cross-sector collaborative. We worked with them to do an assessment of the pipeline for affordable housing in the Bay Area. And it was a bit of a dispiriting exercise because when we asked them to assess what was the number of units that would be required of affordable housing to really address the affordability crisis in the Bay Area, it was a big number. It was really tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of units. When we asked them to look at what was in the pipeline, in other words, all the deals that they knew were at various stages of moving in the Bay Area, then the number was really much smaller. We call this the denominator exercise. So the denominator is the size of the total need, and the numerator is the portion of that need that's being addressed by deals that are currently in process. And when they looked at the fraction, a couple of the members of the team started to cry, literally, because they were working so hard and so diligently and so conscientiously, and yet the fraction was such a dismal number. Well, we said to them, look, you guys are really creative, and we ask that you just stick with this for a while. And they said, well, you know, we used to love coming to your events, but this is really a depressing exercise. And we said, you know, stick with it. And sure enough, the next morning when they came back to the work, one of the people on the team from the transit agency said, you know, part of the reason that our pipeline is so small is that we're constantly chasing our tail to raise money to acquire land to build affordable housing. And so the gap, the choke point that we're really facing is a lack of land. And the way we've been trying to deal with that is by raising money to buy some. What if we thought about who owns the land already that could be persuaded to use land in ways that would be consistent with our objectives? And they said, well, you know, interestingly, the transit agency owns 300 acres of land right by the transit stops. And they had just become subject to a California state law that made affordable housing an acceptable use of publicly owned land, even at less than full market rates. And so they decided to go to first the general manager and then the board of BART to get permission to develop intensively affordable housing on that BART-owned land. And sure enough, they were able to get the permission. So that all of a sudden increased the scale at which they were able to work from projects of 50 and 100 units at a time that were a struggle on their own to a batch process where they could think about developing thousands of units at a time. So obviously a very major breakthrough. That's what this work looks like when people are able to collaborate across sectors and use a pretty systematic assessment of these functions to think of how the system could function differently. So to wrap up, I would like to just go through some of the leverage points that we hope you, through your experience with us, will be able to work on in ways that will help you break through to achieve more of your community's priorities. The first is to frame the problem in a way that's clear and articulate the priorities in such a way that you can build alignment across stakeholders and across sectors. Because if people aren't working together, then you're not going to be able to overcome the pull of gravity to make money go uphill. The second piece is to really back map and say, what would it take for us to solve the problem at scale? What would it take to get beyond the deals of the 50 and 100 units to get to the scale of the problem? And that may involve a sort of cold-eyed look at what is required, and some of it may be daunting. It's not going to take a week, but we think it's really important to ask the questions of scale in such a way that we can find different ways to approach things. The third piece is to think about taking a systems approach together. We found that it's really important to create space for discussion, for cross-sector thinking, for boundary crossing. People really do tend to work in silos, and finding ways to stitch together resources and to stitch together power is an important part of solving the problem. Equally important is to think beyond the currently traditional stakeholders in the system and reach out to new players who may have aligned interests. For example, we found that many health systems, newly concerned about what they call the upstream social determinants of health, but what many of us in the community development area simply call our traditional work, brings new allies to the work in ways that can add resources, can add staff expertise, and can add power. So think about who might these new partners be. Some of them will be local institutions that haven't been involved before, but they may also be people from outside of the region or from outside of the city that have needed skills that are missing in the system. So thinking about how to engage those stakeholders and bring them in is really an important thing. So the fourth piece is to look at the pipeline and understand where are its strengths, where are its gaps, where does it match what we need in terms of scale and in terms of type of deal, and where do we need to bolster that pipeline so that it will be stronger? Who might we bring into the system that can put together the kinds of deals that we need, and how do we get them in? And then finally, what can we do in the enabling environment? What are the policies and practices that are already helping us, and what are the ones that are missing that if we could simply add them would make a big difference in our work? And then who are the people who can convene, who can be responsible for getting us the data that we need, and who can change their own practices in ways that support the growth of the system? We look forward to working with you on this interesting and important work, and we encourage you, if you have any questions, to reach out to us and let us know. We will do everything we can to be of assistance. Very good luck.